Hello, everyone. My name is Naeem Dargouth from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and welcome to the 10th edition of the Tracking the Sun webinar. Today, Galen Barbos will be speaking for the main part of the webinar. I did want to remind you that the Tracking the Sun report, as well as the underlying data behind each of the figures, is available on trackingthesun.lbl.gov. The webinar is in listen-only mode, but do please ask questions during the webinar that I'll be collecting, and we'll have a question and answer session at the end of Galen's presentation. The chat box is at the bottom left of your screen, and just enter your questions as we go. No need to wait till the end of the webinar to ask questions. Also reminding you that the webinar is being recorded. With that, I'll turn it over to Galen Barbos, research scientist in the Electricity Markets and Policy Group here at LBL.
Great. Thanks, Naeem, and thanks to everyone on the webinar for joining today. As Naeem mentioned, we'll be reviewing the findings from the latest edition of our annual Tracking the Sun report, the 10th edition in this series. Before jumping into that, though, I'll just remind you all of the URL here that Naeem pointed you towards. You can find really everything you might want to know about this report at that address. So with that, let's begin. So for those of you that aren't familiar with it, Tracking the Sun is focused on describing installed price trends for grid-connected residential and non-residential PV systems in the US, so basically distributed solar. Berkeley Lab has a separate companion annual report that's focused on the utility scale solar sector, which was also released recently, and our colleagues Mark Bollinger and Yo Seal will be hosting a webinar on that report next week. So this latest edition of Tracking the Sun is focused primarily on projects installed through the end of last year, and also includes some data for the first half of the present year, 2017. In discussing all of this data, we'll be focusing on trends related to kind of two different things, related things. First is the trajectory in national median installed prices, and then the second is kind of variability in those prices across projects. Recognizing that there are, of course, other things that folks might want to do with this data or look at. As Naeem mentioned, we published a public version of that underlying data set. Our colleagues at the National Renewable Energy Lab have been kind enough to let us post that data on their OpenPV data portal, which many of you may already be familiar with. And so that's the data that I'm going to be talking about today. And it includes about 1.1 million individual data records, and for each of those, maybe 50 or 60 different data fields. So we'll be just kind of talking about a subset of all of that here today. Important to note, though, is that this report, Tracking the Sun, is really just one element in a larger portfolio of ongoing research activities by Berkeley Lab and by our colleagues over at NREL. I've mentioned already the first two of these are utility scale solar report and NREL's OpenPV project. In addition, we've been engaged over the past few years with some researchers at several universities on a series of projects that involve more in-depth statistical analysis of the data that we collect for Tracking the Sun. Whereas Tracking the Sun is sort of more focused on descriptive trends, these other analyses have kind of delved more deeply into that data using somewhat more sophisticated techniques. And I'll talk kind of briefly about some of that work later on in the presentation. And then finally, last on the slide here, our colleagues at NREL also issue an annual report benchmarking PV system costs, but that work is based instead on kind of detailed bottom-up engineering modeling. There's a slide later where I'll present, just for comparative purposes, some of the numbers that they've published as well. So before delving into the results, I do want to give a bit about the data sources and some of the kind of key aspects of the data cleaning process. First, just to make sure we're all on the same page here, Tracking the Sun is focused on the installed price of PV, which is to say the upfront dollar per watt price paid by the owner of the PV system, and that's prior to any incentives. So that PV system owner might either be the host customer or maybe a third-party owner, but in either case, what we're looking at here is the price of a transaction between one party selling a PV system to another party. In terms of the different customer segments, Tracking the Sun, as I mentioned, is focused on residential and non-residential systems. These sectoral definitions can be a little bit fuzzy, but in the context of this report, we define non-residential systems to include roof-mounted PV systems of any size, and we have a few in our data set that are up in the 5 to 10 megawatt range. In addition, we also include ground-mounted projects up to 5 megawatts. Ground-mounted projects larger than 5 megawatts get put in the utility scale bucket, and those are covered in the other report. So just to be clear about what's in and what's out here. And then last, all of the units that we present here are denominated in real 2016 dollars, and the system size and capacity data are presented in DC direct current watts or kilowatts. So the data for this report consist of individual project level data records, so individual PV systems. We collect this data from a variety of different state agencies and utilities. These are entities that administer PV incentive programs or solar renewable energy certificate registration systems or interconnection processes. Some of this data is already out there in the public domain. Some of you might be familiar with the California currently interconnected data set, for example. A number of other states also put some of this data out there in the public. So we're kind of collecting a lot of this and kind of transforming it into a kind of a structure that it can all be analyzed together. Now, to be sure, these data, they have their inherent limitations. And it's important to be clear about some of those. So first and foremost is, these are self-reported data by installers and customers, and so there's always, some potential for inconsistent reporting there. Second, these data, as I mentioned, represent transaction prices. And that's not the same as the cost, the underlying cost borne by the installer or developer, and there are a variety of different reasons, of course, why cost and price might diverge. Third, these data are historical. They're based on projects, as I mentioned, that were installed through the end of last year, and then we've got a little bit of data on projects installed in the first 6 months of the present year. And so the numbers I'm going to be presenting here, they kind of lag behind what you might find if you were to go out and solicit quotes today for a system that would be installed sometime in the future. So just keep that in mind. And then fourth and finally, we end up scrubbing out of the data that we use for our analysis a pretty large fraction of third-party owned systems. And I'll talk more about that on the next slide, but the key thing to note here is just that those third-party owned systems that we scrub out tend to be for some of the largest installers in the country. And so the final sample that we have is kind of skewed a bit towards smaller and medium-sized installers. Now we spend a lot of our time on this project basically cleaning up data and kind of merging in additional data related to equipment details and other things. This is, I would say, definitely the least glamorous part of the work, but possibly kind of the biggest value add. And that's why, as Naeem mentioned and I mentioned, we've started making the underlying data set publicly available. So I don't want to dwell too much on the details listed on the slide here, but it is important to explain a bit further how we deal with these third-party owned systems. And so I want to just focus in on the text box at the bottom here. So the key distinction is between integrated and non-integrated TPO providers. So integrated TPO providers are where you've got a single company that provides both the installation service and the customer financing. And in these cases, the prices that are getting reported are typically some sort of appraised value, and that's simply because there is no sale of the individual system from which a transaction can be reported. And so, for our purposes, we don't want to mix and match appraised values with transaction prices, and so we just kind of scrub those systems out of our final data sample, though they are retained within the public data set. In contrast, then you have non-integrated TPO providers, and these are where you've got two different entities, kind of a customer finance provider and an installation contractor who sells the system to the finance provider. And in those cases, there is an actual sale of the system taking place and a transaction price associated with that sale. And that's what gets reported to these various entities who then provide us data. And we retain those non-integrated TPO systems in our analysis, though as I'll later show, prices for those systems have actually begun to diverge from kind of customer-owned or host-owned systems for reasons that I'll talk about. So here's where you can get some sense for the size of our data sample and how it compares to the larger population of systems in the US. What we call our full data sample, that's the middle orange bars in the figure here. That's what we have before scrubbing out the integrated TPO systems, before scrubbing out systems with missing installed price data, and some of the other kind of categories of systems that we end up excluding from our ultimate analysis. As I mentioned, this full data sample is the basis for the public data file. So if you go online and download the data file, this is basically what you'll get. And that consists of about 1.1 million individual PV projects installed through the end of last year, which collectively represent about 83% of all distributed PV systems installed in the US through that point, and a little over 3/4 of the systems installed just in last year. So after we have that kind of full sample, we then winnow it down by removing those integrated TPO systems, by removing systems with missing installed price data, and a few others. And then we're left with what we call our final analysis sample, which consists of about 630,000 systems. And so that's what we basically use for all the figures in this report and presentation, with a few exceptions that I'll note. Now there's one trend here that I want to point out because it ends up being important later on. So you can see in the figure here that the gap between the full data sample, the orange bars, and the final analysis sample, the yellow bars, it kind of began to widen in about 2013. And then it started narrowing over the past couple years, but especially last year in 2016. And this is basically a California phenomenon. So what was happening here is that starting in mid-2013 or so, the state's main incentive program began to wind down. And along with that, the collection of installed price data as well. And so ultimately, the state ended up kind of transitioning data collection responsibilities over to the utilities, and they started collecting installed price data again, but that transition didn't really complete until kind of mid-2015. And so although we've got all California systems in our data sample, in the full data sample, we're missing installed price data for a decent fraction of California systems over the 2013 to kind of mid-2015 period. So that will become important later on when we start looking at some of the installed price trends, and I'll kind of explain how and why that is important then. A few additional details on the underlying data sample. On the top of the slide here, we show system size trends over time. And here, as in the remainder of the presentation, we're going to break systems out into the 3 different customer segments shown here. So residential, non-residential systems less than 500 kilowatts, and then larger non-residential systems greater than 500 kilowatts. Now, across all 3 of these customer segments, you can see in those top charts that system sizes have been growing over time. I'll call your attention to the middle chart, in particular the values along the y-axis there. So this is for non-residential systems less than 500 kilowatts. You can see, though, that these systems in general are much, much smaller than that. So throughout this presentation, we kind of refer to that middle group as being small non-residential, even though you might not think of 500 kilowatts as being particularly small. In fact, most of those systems are kind of down in the, say, 20 to 40 kilowatt size range. Now, looking at the bottom of the set of charts here, we see the geographic distribution of the sample over time. And you can see that California, the dark blue, definitely dominates across all 3 segments. And for the reasons discussed on the last slide, you can see that its proportion of the data sample has kind of shot up over the past year or 2. Beyond California, most of the remaining systems in the sample are concentrated basically in 6 states: Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Arizona, Texas, and North Carolina. We've got basically 25 states represented within the sample, but it's really those 7 states that kind of represent the vast majority, and that's largely reflective of the broader market. So just real quickly here, I want to show the sample distribution in terms of system ownership. And basically, I think the main point here is for residential systems, you can see that the third-party ownership share really grew pretty dramatically until about 2012 and has remained somewhat flat since then. Actually, in the last year, you saw a slight decline in the third-party ownership share, and that's kind of reflective of just the broader market trends back towards customer ownership. For the non-residential sectors, the TPO shares are smaller. You can also see we've distinguished between integrated and non-integrated TPO, that for the non-residential sectors, the TPO systems are primarily non-integrated providers, and so we don't end up having to scrub too many data points out for the non-residential sectors. For residential systems, it's obviously a much different story where, the last few years we ended up having to drop about 40% of the initial data sample due to appraised value systems. Now that you've bared with me through all that background, let's start looking at the pricing trends. And we'll start out by looking at kind of high-level trends in national median installed prices. So here we see long-term historical trends going back to the year 2000, or as close to it as we can go given the data that we have. And first and foremost, you'll see that there's just over this whole time period been a pretty phenomenal drop in prices. For residential systems, it's been about 7% per year on average over the full time series. Over the last 2 years of the analysis period, though, from 2015 to 2016, median prices fell by only about 10 cents per watt, or 2% year over year for residential, and somewhat greater amounts for the non-residential segments. And these were actually the lowest year-over-year declines in pricing going back to about 2009. And there are a few different things going on here. So on the one hand, it's probably safe to say that much of the low-hanging fruit has probably been picked, both in terms of cost reduction opportunities and also customer acquisition. And so there, may be some degree of natural leveling in the trajectory here. However, there are also 2 other dynamics at play, which are both, I would say, kind of more artifacts of the data. One of them is this California issue. So California, as we'll see later, is a relatively expensive state. And because its share of the final analysis sample has gone up so much in the past year or 2, that has kind of dampened the overall impact on national median prices. The other kind of data issue here is that unsecured loans have become much more prevalent in the residential sector particularly, and the origination fees for those loans, which are often kind of on the order of maybe 15 to 20% of the loan amount, so pretty significant cost, that's often getting rolled into the price of the system. And so part of what we're seeing here is just sort of the internalization of financing costs that otherwise might not have been kind of captured in the installed prices. That past slide showed data through year-end 2016. Here I just want to show kind of quickly some data for the first half of the present year, which seems to suggest that price declines are actually picking back up really across the board for all three different segments. And so if the prices continue to decline over the remainder of the year at the same pace as they did during the first half, we'd end up looking at least 10% year-over-year price declines for each sector, and that's kind of well in line with actually greater than a long-term historical rate of price decline, and kind of supports the premise a little bit that some of that dampening in price decline that we saw over the past year or two was maybe more of a transient data phenomenon and less kind of a fundamental shift in kind of underlying costs and prices. In terms of the sources for installed price reductions, both hardware cost declines and soft cost declines have been important. Over the past year or two, it's really mostly been on the hardware side. And in fact, if you look at the kind of total reduction in module, inverter, and racking prices over the last year of this analysis period, you actually end up with a larger number than the total system level installed price decline. And that can seem a little bit counterintuitive, but what we often see is kind of a little bit of a lag between changes in component prices and system prices. And that notion of a lag kind of lines up pretty well with the larger installed price declines that we saw in the first half of 2017. And in other words, these are sort of the latent effect of component level cost reductions in the prior year. Over the longer term, though, installed price declines have really resulted from both hardware and soft cost reductions. You can get some sense of that in the figure here, where we show on the top the trend in total median installed prices for residential systems. That's the green line. And then underneath that, we show underlying trends in module and inverter prices. We've also got that dotted orange line, which is basically the residual terms, so everything left over once you deduct the module price and inverter price from the total system level installed price. And that residual term really largely captures kind of the aggregate set of soft costs. And so you can see that line, although it's kind of definitely undulated over time, it's generally fallen and fallen pretty substantially over the full period here. Now, many soft costs, as well as some hardware costs, tend to be either fixed costs in nature or like racking, for example, and certain labor costs may be a function of the physical dimensions of the system. Now, there have been two key technological changes that have helped to lower those costs. One has been increases in module efficiency, and the other has been increases in system sizes. So I showed a couple slides ago how system sizes have risen significantly over time. The figure here shows how module efficiencies have grown over time. And And basically you can see that the median module efficiency has grown by roughly 1/3 or so over this historical period, from about 12.7% in 2002 to 17.3% in 2016. And so when we look at the combined effects of both of these technological trends, increasing module efficiency and increasing system size, we get roughly about a $1 per watt reduction in residential system costs. That's about 12% of the total installed price reduction over the same period. So although certainly not the main driver of installed price decline, it's definitely been an important one, especially when you consider that both of these dynamics, the continued increase in system sizes and increasing module efficiencies, those seem to be kind of persisting over time, and so we might anticipate that those trends will continue going to some degree. Now, beyond those technological drivers, there have also been lots of policy-related drivers for PV cost reductions over time, especially on the soft cost side. And one of these policy-related drivers has been the steady decline in incentives for rooftop PV. So the chart here shows the median value of rebates and performance-based incentives received by systems in our data set. And you can see across the board that these have fallen quite substantially over time, and in many cases actually they're no longer even available. Now, part of that trend has been kind of a response to the emergence of other kinds of incentives. For example, the lifting of the per customer cap on the residential ITC back in, I guess, 2009, and the growth of SREC markets in some states. So partly it's been kind of a reactive trend, but it's also been proactive in the sense that some states have really intentionally ratcheted down incentives over time as a way of providing a signal to the industry that they need to bring their costs down. Of course, from the customer's perspective, this also means that much of the decline in installed prices has been offset by a corresponding drop in incentives. And so from the customer's perspective, the economics of solar haven't actually gotten so much better as, they haven't improved as much as what you might think based solely on the trend in prices, because those price declines have been partially offset by these incentive drops. So now tracking the sun data are very good for seeing trends over time, and they can also be useful for providing a snapshot. But one does need to be a bit careful about this, especially when looking at the kind of national median prices. And one way of seeing that is by comparing the median prices for tracking the sun to other recently published PV price or cost benchmarks, which is what we've done here. And in general, you'll see that the tracking the sun median prices tend to be higher than many of the other numbers you see out there. And there are lots of different reasons for this. We've listed some of them on the right-hand side of the slide here. In general, though, what you tend to see is that many of these other benchmarks line up reasonably well with the 20th percentile values in the Tracking the Sun data set. Those are kind of the lower error bands on the chart here, rather than with the medians. And the next section here is really going to kind of start delving into this issue of variability within the Tracking the Sun data, to kind of unpack some of the reasons behind this spread, and in doing so, kind of help to explain why the median values diverge from some of these other pricing benchmarks out there. So just real quickly, one last point of comparison is between the prices in the US and in other countries. We don't have a huge set of comparisons here. We're just looking at 3 other countries: Australia, France, and Japan. And I think really the key thing to note here is that all 3 of these countries show lower prices than the US. Hardware costs are not identical across countries, but they're pretty similar. And so really most of the difference that we see here in installed system level prices really has to do with differences in soft costs across countries. And so, there are many different factors at play there. You might expect that larger countries would tend to have lower prices, or larger, national markets would tend to have lower prices. In Japan, for example, much larger amounts of distributed solar have been installed than in the U.S., and so that might be part of the reason why prices there are lower. But then you can also see, Australia and France, they are below the U.S. in terms of installed capacity, but also below in terms of installed prices. And so clearly there are a variety of other factors at play, and we've kind of listed some of the possibilities here at the bottom of the slide. So for the rest of the presentation, I want to focus in on kind of the variability in installed prices. I think that can be pretty instructive, maybe more instructive in some ways than focusing on median prices. And so I'm going to just kind of start out by looking at just the overall variability, just in order to kind of give a sense for kind of what this phenomenon is that we want to explain. So the figures here show the distribution in prices for systems installed just last year in 2016. And you can see clearly just a ton of spread in the data. Among residential systems, for example, 20% were below $3.20 a watt, while another 20% were up above $5 a watt, and then kind of similar spread for the non-residential systems. There are lots of reasons or possible reasons for this variability. Everything from differences in system design, installer business model, policy and regulatory environment. We'll kind of get into some of those in the next set of slides. The wide variability here is also, I think, instructive as just a means of demonstrating the potential for low-cost installations. So, for example, looking at the residential market, although it's small in percentage terms, still more than 15,000 residential systems were installed last year below $2.50 a watt. 8,000 systems were installed at less than $2 a watt. So, the market is definitely seeing some very low prices, and in the following slides, I think we'll get a better sense kind of for when and how that's happening. So here we just see how system size can impact PV system pricing. Obviously, we've kind of controlled for that by segmenting the systems into residential and then the two different non-residential markets. But even within residential and non-residential segments, you can see quite a bit of difference in pricing based on just variation in system size. So on the top, we show residential systems. Most residential systems in our sample are kind of somewhere in the 2 to 14 kilowatt size range. There are small numbers up beyond that, but generally you're kind of in that range. And you can see just within that span, pretty big difference in pricing levels from $4.50 a watt down to $3.60 or less than that. The bottom chart is for non-residential systems. Obviously, the size of non-residential systems spans a much wider range, and correspondingly a much kind of wider range in prices associated with those sizing differences. Basically, almost a 50% difference from kind of the smallest size end of the spectrum to the largest size end of the spectrum for non-residential systems. And of course, if you go to utility scale, you're potentially looking at even lower prices. Now, prices also vary quite a bit from state to state. In the figure at the top, which focuses on residential systems installed in 2016, state-level median prices range from a low of about $2.90 a watt in Nevada to a high of $5 a watt in Delaware. The red line in the figure here shows the national median, so those are the numbers that we looked at before. And you can see that actually most states are below that national median. And the reason there is just that kind of the largest state markets in terms of numbers of systems, and those are California, Massachusetts, and New York. Those tend to be relatively high-priced states, and so obviously for obvious mathematical reasons that tends to pull the median upward. More or less the same story in the bottom chart for non-residential systems, where most states are below that national median, in some cases kind of well below. These state-level pricing differences, they arise for different reasons, some of which I've kind of already alluded to. The degree of competition within local markets, for example, retail electricity rates and incentive levels, and then also project characteristics for particular to each region. So, one of the drivers, for example, for higher prices in California is that for whatever reason, there's just a much higher penetration of premium efficiency modules among residential systems in California. And we'll see in a later slide that systems with premium efficiency modules tend to be more expensive. So that's kind of one among a multiple of reasons for why prices might vary between states. When it comes to third-party owned systems, as I mentioned, the focus of this report is on the transaction price between the installer and the customer finance provider who purchases the system. And when we compare those prices to install prices for host-owned systems, we can see some interesting trends here. So in particular, I'll draw your attention to the left-hand side of the top chart, which focuses on residential systems and compares median prices for TPO versus host-owned systems over time. And you can see that TPO and host-owned systems have pretty similar prices for the first few years. But then starting in 2015 and continuing in 2016, you see this big divergence where prices for TPO systems continue to fall, but prices for host-owned systems basically remained flat from 2014 to 2016. Resulting in about a 70 cent per watt delta between host-owned and TPO systems last year. The bottom chart does this comparison on a state-by-state basis, and there, although the magnitude of the difference varies from state to state, you see pretty consistently that TPO systems, at least within the residential sector, were lower priced last year than host-owned systems. And this reflects a combination of factors. I previously mentioned this issue of unsecured loans, which obviously apply for host-owned systems, where you've got loan origination fees that are getting rolled into the price of those systems. So that's maybe part of what's going on here. In some cases, customer acquisition and other project development costs for third-party owned systems, those might be borne by the financier rather than by the installer. And so the price that the installer is charging for their system, it really doesn't kind of reflect any customer acquisition costs. They're not bearing those costs. And this has kind of become a little bit more prevalent as the industry just becomes more specialized. TPO financiers are also relatively sophisticated buyers, one would think, and so presumably have a bit more negotiating power than your average Joe or Jane homeowner. And then last, there can be a bit more standardization in the design of TPO systems, and so that as well could potentially lead to kind of lower average or median prices for those systems. Now, quite a bit of the pricing variability in the data set, it also can kind of be traced to differences across installers. And here we show median prices by installer, focusing just on residential systems installed in 2016, and looking at just kind of the 5 largest state markets in particular. So just to explain what's going on here, each of the dots or data points in the figure here represents the median price charged by an individual installer in a particular state. and then we just kind of rank order those installer level medians for each state, and that's what each of these lines represents. So just to give some sense in kind of the spread across installers, you can look at the 20th percentile and 80th percentile values along each of these lines, and you can see, based on that metric, anywhere from say a 70 cent per watt to $1.40 per watt difference between installers at the 20th percentile level and installers at the 80th percentile level. So clearly, a lot of the variation that we see really has to do with the installers themselves. And some of this is just a matter of differences in business models. At the low end, perhaps you've got some of those installers that I mentioned who are kind of primarily doing wrench work for TPO finance providers and aren't really managing any of the sales and customer acquisition processes. And so the prices that they're charging are naturally lower just because they're kind of responsible for a narrower set of activities. Whereas at the high end, maybe you've got companies that specialize in more premium systems, or who might be bundling PV systems with other upgrades and reporting a single price for the whole project. So kind of different things going on here, but obviously a lot of variation across installers. Now, one of the drivers that you might expect to be at play here is installer size. Somewhat surprisingly, when we break out the data according to installer size, we actually don't see much in terms of any clear pattern with respect to pricing. And that's what the figure here shows, where aside from California, where there's maybe a slight incline, most of the other states, there's really no discernible trend, I would say. And one theory for why that might be is that there could be some competing dynamics going on. So on the one hand, higher volume installers, perhaps have some economies of scale in terms of their business operations, and maybe some efficiencies as a result of just greater accumulated experience. But on the other hand, these higher volume installers may also have some degree of market power, or reputational advantages that they can leverage into higher prices. And these installers can also potentially have higher customer acquisition costs. At least that's kind of historically been the case. And so there have been a few more in-depth studies that have been done that kind of look at these issues in more detail, and I would say to varying degrees have kind of found support for both of these dynamics. So indeed, it really kind of may be that these things are counteracting one another to some degree. One other really significant driver for installed price differences across projects is the module technology. And I kind of mentioned this in passing before in connection with California. So the top charts here show the distribution across our project sample of the module efficiencies used in each project. And you can see basically a bimodal distribution where you've got one hump that consists primarily of polycrystalline modules that have efficiencies in the kind of 15 to 17% range. And then you've got another hump centered out around 20% efficiency, and those are the monocrystalline modules. For the purpose of our comparison here, we're just going to kind of draw a line at 18% and say, everything below is standard efficiency, everything above is premium efficiency. And then in the chart below, we just compare installed prices based on whether or not a system had standard efficiency or premium efficiency modules. And you can see there's a pretty consistent and pretty significant difference here. Last year it was about a 50 cents per watt difference between systems that had premium efficiency modules and those with standard efficiency modules, and kind of similar deltas in prior years. So now, the main reason for this, of course, is that premium efficiency modules are more expensive. So you would expect that the systems with those modules to also be more expensive. On the other hand, higher efficiency modules also do allow some savings on balance of systems costs, just because you've got a smaller footprint for a given system size, and so potentially some savings on racking and labor and maybe a few other things. Clearly, though, those BOS savings don't kind of counteract the the price premium for the modules themselves. And so that's why on net, we see higher installed system prices for those projects. Now, PV installed in residential new construction also is consistently, quite a bit less expensive than retrofit, and so that's another reason for some of the variability that we see in our data set. Though, realistically, of course, new construction is maybe 3–5% of the residential market as a whole. But it still, I think, is important to kind of understand this difference because it does have maybe some policy implications. So I think it's first, though, important to understand just some of the technological differences between new construction and retrofit systems. And so that's what the two slides at the top help to illustrate. The first of these shows system size. And you can see that new construction systems are generally quite a bit smaller than retrofit systems. Usually they're kind of in the 2 to 3 kilowatt size range, whereas retrofits, are generally closer to 5, 6, 7 kilowatts. The other difference between these two segments is that new construction systems tend to use premium efficiency modules much more often, and that partly may just have to do with space constraints or it being easier to sell a home with a physically smaller PV system on the rooftop that's maybe a little bit kind of less intrusive for potential home buyers. Whatever the case may be, obviously smaller system size and premium efficiency modules in and of themselves would tend to make systems more expensive. When you look at the figure on the bottom, which compares the installed price of retrofits and new construction, on the left we compare just kind of all new construction versus all retrofit, and you can see that despite those kind of technological differences, new construction systems do still tend to be a little bit cheaper. However, if you kind of control for those technological issues, as we've done on the right, and just focus on small systems with premium efficiency modules, you can see a much bigger cost advantage for new construction. And the main reasons for that are you've got some economies of scale with new construction. These are usually large housing developments, and then some economies of scope. Where often you're able to kind of piggyback on some of the electrical and roofing labor that's maybe already on site, rather than having to call out additional truck rolls for system installations as you would in a retrofit setting. So I'm kind of running out of time here, and so I'm going to kind of fast forward through the last couple slides here. I'll just kind of note very briefly the one here compares commercial and tax-exempt systems, and we can see pretty consistently over time that systems installed at what we call tax-exempt sites, so this is schools, governments, nonprofits, religious organizations, those systems tend to be more expensive than similarly sized systems installed at for-profit commercial sites. And there are kind of a number of institutional reasons why that might be. I mentioned earlier that we've been engaged in some kind of more in-depth statistical analyses of this data, and these have been collaborations with researchers at NREL as well as at several universities. Just listed here some of the studies that have come out of this work. I'd encourage you, if you're interested, to check some of these out. I think these sort of delve more deeply into some of the issues that I've talked about here, and also I think delve into some other topics that we're not really able to kind of look at through descriptive means. Link at the bottom of the page here takes you to the website where you can find all of these papers. So with that, I'll just kind of wrap things up by noting a few big picture themes here. First, it's clear that install prices for both residential and non-residential PV have, of course, fallen quite dramatically over time. But to maintain that continued progress, it's going to be important to focus not just on the hardware side of things, but also on the soft cost side, as that's really where the bulk of system costs now reside, and therefore kind of where the bulk of opportunities for further cost reductions reside. We've already seen pretty significant reductions in soft costs over the long run. But when we look around at what's happening both in other countries and also just within the U.S. and kind of the widespread variability in system prices that we see, it's clear that there's still lots of near-term potential for further soft cost reductions. Getting there is going to require a combination of different strategies, partly a matter of building market scale, but I suspect there's going to be a continued need for, kind of more targeted initiatives and R&D activities that really kind of focus in on specific soft cost elements and soft cost reduction opportunities. So with that, let me just thank you all for your time and attention. The slide here lists various destinations on the web where you can go to find additional information. I know we've got only maybe 5 or 10 minutes left here for Q&A, so I'm going to turn things over to Naeem, who I suspect has a queue of questions waiting to be asked. Naeem.
Thank you so much, Galen, for the presentation, and indeed we do have a few questions. Please do continue to send them my way here on the left side in the chat box. So a few questions came up again on the data sources, and I guess the basic question here is whether the data sources are generally publicly available. And if they're not publicly available, what kind of data sources are behind the analysis and the figures?
Yeah, so I kind of talked about this very briefly, but we get this data from state agencies and utilities from around the country. These are entities that administer incentive programs and collect the data through those programs, or administer SREC registration programs or interconnection processes and are collecting the data through those channels. They then provide it to us, and we kind of assimilate it all together with lots of data scrubbing and whatnot. In terms of what's publicly available, so we have developed a public data file that we've posted online, and you can go to the website here to find that. Much of the underlying data, though, is also available kind of from the original sources, or some of it is. So, California, for example, has its currently interconnected data set, which includes basically every single system installed in the state of California, and then that, of course, is absorbed within our larger data set. Some of the other states have also made some data available. And so, we're assimilating all of that. Obviously, folks can go and piece it together on their own, but we thought we would save you the trouble by just publishing it all ourselves. So that's what this public data file is mentioned on the slide here.
Great. So there was one question that's not perhaps directly related to what was presented, but the question is about prices and whether there's any evidence that prices are higher when incentives are higher. So if there's some kind of value-based pricing, perhaps, for PV.
Yep. No, that's a great question, and it's been definitely an issue on our radar for quite some time. So we haven't looked at that within the context of tracking the sun, but some of these kind of more in-depth statistical analyses have looked at that issue. I would call your attention, I guess, first to the paper Gillingham et al. 2014 listed here. So this was a paper that kind of took a everything in the kitchen sink type regression, econometric regression analysis to try to understand what's driving all this variability. And one of the things that it included in that kitchen sink was the kind of aggregate value of incentives that each system received, and included that includes both kind of direct incentives as well as kind of net metering based bill savings. And that work did find an effect. It found that there was about a 40-cent per watt effect between those systems with kind of the lowest incentives and those systems with the highest incentives. Now, there are different interpretations of what that means, right? I mean, one interpretation is that, okay, in places with high incentives, installers are, kind of padding their pockets by marking up, their prices, and that's kind of this value-based pricing notion. There's another explanation, which is just that when you have higher incentives, you have higher demand. And for anybody that's kind of looked at supply and demand curves, when you've got more demand for something, you end up with higher prices. And kind of, more sort of like operationally what that means in the context of the PV market is you end up with, less efficient installers that are able to sort of survive in the market because there's such a high demand. So it kind of pushes that margin out further. It doesn't mean that all installers are charging high prices, but it does mean that in really kind of overheated markets where you've got a huge amount of demand, it, at least in the short run, right? There's kind of the short run effect and the long run effect, but at least in the short run, it kind of enables less efficient or more expensive companies to operate. So that's kind of the alternate interpretation.
Great. We probably have time for just one more question as it's approaching the top of the hour. And one is, a couple people asked about ground-mounted or tracking systems and that we had included in previous years, and we were wondering if we had done any analysis on that this year.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, actually, I moved that slide to the very end here because I was certain that I wouldn't have time to get to it, but it sounds like folks actually wanted to hear about it. So, so yeah, the figure here, and I'll be very quick, this compares prices for ground-mounted and rooftop systems just in the non-residential sector. And the trends are a little bit messy here, largely because we just don't have very complete data on whether systems are ground-mounted and whether they have tracking. So it's pretty small sample sizes here and therefore pretty volatile trends. That being said, we do see pretty consistently that ground-mounted systems, at least within this non-residential segment, do tend to be a little bit more expensive than roof-mounted systems. And that could just be due to the fact that there are some additional costs associated with kind of site preparation and laying the foundation. It's not huge differences, and arguably it's kind of within the greater noise within the data set. But you do see, kind of comparing the light blue bars to the yellow bars, that in general, from year to year, those fixed ground-mounted projects are a little bit more expensive than the roof-mounted projects. Again, though, these are kind of pretty volatile trends, and I would be hesitant to place too much emphasis on the exact numerical difference here.
Great. And with that, it's 11 a.m., and we'd like to thank you for participating and listening in on this webinar. If you have any questions, of course, you can follow up with either Galen or myself. And our information is up at trackingthesun.lbl.gov.
Thanks, Naeem. Thanks, everybody.